Hi, welcome to the Midtown Vineyard Podcast. We're so glad you've joined us online. For daily encouragement, events, service times, and more, check out our website and social media. And now, this week's message.
Amen. Well, it's been hours and hours of torrential downpours, buckets and buckets of rain, sheets of water pounding your ship. Made worse by the fact that it's happening over ocean. So there's an endless supply of weaponry, ammunition, all aimed at destroying your primitive wooden vessel. Relentless gusts of wind, the likes of which would flatten communities should it happen on land. And not long before, you just saw a crew member get thrown overboard, thrust by the wind into that black hole, that gray void of an ocean. There's no way he survived. Just as easily could have been you. And for him, as all men do, he flashes back to his childhood, the mother who was taken when he was 6, the mistreatment that he endured when sent away to boarding school, his enlistment into seafaring by age 11, going onto a boat, his tailspin from there, the long descent to the bottom, a career marked by, in his own words, headstrong disobedience. He showed a knack for melody. He showed a gift for meter and verse and rhyme. He'd used this gift to openly mock his captains. He would write obscene poems and songs so popular, so vulgar that the crews would all join in, and so he'd routinely be punished. Often he was starved nearly to death, several times imprisoned. Once, while aboard a ship named the Greyhound, he'd gained notoriety for being what the captain called the most profane man he'd ever met. This is among sailors. We have an expression that one curses like a sailor, and for this man, the captain said, "You are the most profane man I've ever met." In a culture where sailors habitually swear, he'd be punished not just for overuse among sailors of the worst words in existence. He'd be punished for using the worst of the worst so much. He would be punished for inventing new words. The captain said there were new ones he'd never heard before because, one, he wasn't as crude as this sailor, and two, this sailor would invent new ones that would exceed the limits of verbal debauchery. This is a bad man. No one starts out on a slave ship, not by choice, but after that rough upbringing, the denouncement of your faith in God, the faith of your mother, who had passed when you were young, this man would enter the Royal Navy. He'd try to escape the Royal Navy not long after. He would be captured. He would be stripped and beaten in front of his shipmates. Later, he would tell that he even contemplated killing the captain and committing suicide. He'd show continual disobedience, requiring continual punishment. His obscenity would land him more and more demoted, further and further and further down, until you're unemployable by anybody other than slave traders. They're considered the lowest of the low. And even aboard those ships, he'd regularly be imprisoned with the slaves they carried. No one sets out to become a slave trader. Even back then, they knew it was despicable. One lands there, though, when there's no other options available. It seems between his character, his debauchery, his mouth, he had a knack for hitting bottom. And when it was certain there was no further down to go, he'd still find an elevator with a down switch. Perhaps that's how he'd ended up here this stormy night, after hours of the crew emptying water from the ship, expecting to be capsized. He and another mate would tie themselves to the ship's pump to keep from being washed overboard. If this will not do, he later reflected, the Lord have mercy on us. Hours later, he'd return to that deck to steer for the next 11 hours. And he says that during these 11 hours, during that time at the wheel, he would ponder God. He would ponder his own life. He would ponder existence. The words that he muttered, "Lord, have mercy on us," during that moment of desperation in the storm, they rang in his head. He began to ask if he was worthy of God's mercy, or in any way redeemable whatsoever. Not only had he neglected his faith, he directly opposed it. He mocked people who communicated they had a faith. He derided and denounced God as a myth. He came to believe that God was using this storm, though, on this open sea to send a profound message, to begin a work in him. But is that even possible? Can someone so degenerate, so lost, so obscene, so blind be saved? Can God turn a person like that around? He wasn't sure. Can Jesus intercept a life so dramatically that it's as if there's two different people represented, the one before Christ and the one after? Is that even possible? And to answer this question, the Apostle John, in a gospel he wrote, a gospel we've been studying, tells us a story. If you have your Bibles, open up to John chapter 9. You'll remember we've been studying the Gospel of John for the last several weeks. John is the disciple who wrote last. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have all been in publication. Oh, they're in print. John's had decades to reflect over, to refer back to what they tell, the stories they write. They want to tell you what Jesus did, what Jesus said. And with these decades and decades under his belt to sit and think about all Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote, John, as an old man, sits down and he goes, they handled the what? I want to handle the who. I want to tell you who he was. Oh, his earthly story starts in a Bethlehem manger, but make no mistake, he has no origin. He's before time. He made his debut onto the time frame in Bethlehem. But this Jesus stands outside of time. He is God. And then John goes, oh, let me tell you some stories the other guys didn't tell you. Let me choose some characteristic people, some representative people that Jesus intercepted, that he spoke to, that might speak to you, right? So in John 3, he tells us about a man named Nicodemus, a religious man, a religious leader, someone who had earned rank with people in hopes of earning his way to God. And he still didn't have peace, and that drew him to Jesus. He had some questions, but he didn't want to get caught asking them. So he meets Jesus in the secret of night under the cloak of darkness, and there Jesus says, oh, your whole worldview is backwards. God is for lost people. Jesus was sent not to condemn the world, but to save it. From there, in John 4, he finds a woman who is Samaritan, who is immoral. I mean, the worst of the worst of the worst in that worldview. And Jesus goes, hey, God noticed you enough to send me to you. I've come for the sick. I've come for the lost. I've come for the broken. He routinely says this to people. Just to prove the point, a chapter later, he finds a paralyzed man in John chapter 5 hanging out, waiting for his healing. Oh, he's been paralyzed 38 years. And Jesus goes just to find him. And not just to find him, he enters through the sheep gate. No righteous rabbi, no self-respecting rabbi would go in through this animal gate, and yet Jesus does. He wants to find him to say, God's not far from you. God sees you, and boom, he speaks healing on him. By John 6, he makes a buffet from a lunchbox. By John 8, he forgives a woman everybody else wanted to condemn. And then in John chapter 9, Jesus says, oh, I'm always drawing close to the people who think they're far from me. He finds a man, a life so backwards, so blind, so lost, and he's able to speak healing on it. He wants to find those marginalized. He goes after people who are broken in their expectations of God and their expectations of life. Those are the people Jesus draws close to. So, John chapter 9. Did I give you enough time to turn there? That felt like a long time. Was that good? Okay, John 9, here we go. John chapter 9, verse 1. As he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. Circle, underline, highlight, blind from birth. It seems that this is an important detail, and maybe there was something about this man that the other people just kind of know. They know his backstory. They know he didn't get turned blind. He didn't get struck blind. He was born blind. 2, his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" So the last chapter, right, Jesus moves past people who want to execute a woman. He's able to move them along, and he moves along now. In verse 1, it says, as he went along, so he continues his journey. He's moving along. He's continuing to move. This happens routinely in the Gospels. They come upon a man that the disciples must have been somewhat familiar with. They know that he didn't turn blind, that he didn't end up blind, that he wasn't struck blind. No, he was born blind, and they want an answer for this. He seemed like a more than ordinary sufferer, so there must be a more than ordinary punishment here, right? I mean, we can't just expect a world where bad things happen. No, God had to have sentenced this man to be blind. Remember, this man is surrounded by religious leaders who all had expectations of God, very precise, very defined answers. Their jobs were not only to be good, but to know everything. And for all their supposed knowledge, they needed to have an answer for this. How could someone be born blind? Oh, these leaders, they had figured God out. There were theories about this because they had formulas. They had possibilities. In this case, there were 2 explanations that kind of prevailed the worldview of the day. One, his blind birth, the fact that he's born blind, is a punishment upon his parents through him. Real thing. That was a believed thing. Like that the parents had sinned, so the disciples asking this question, right? They're revealing, like this was a predominant worldview. Like maybe the parents did something, and so this man's blindness was a result of their sin. God was punishing the parents through him. And then the second possibility, and this one's going to make you laugh, but I promise it's true. They believed it was possible for a fetus to sin in the womb. Right? That's how forcibly they tried to apply principles or expectations or definitions to God. Like they had to have an answer no matter how ridiculous the answer seems. They believed it's possible for a baby to sin in the womb and thus be born blind. Right? Because again, you got to have an answer. When there's a more than ordinary sufferer, there seems like a more than ordinary sinner. The disciples believed this so much they wondered if the man had sinned before his birth, because that was something that was told to people in that day and age, an explanation of why this sort of thing happened. They were wondering, did God punish his parents or they punish him for a sin he committed in the womb? Look what Jesus says. I love verse 3. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. So he's answering the question. And he's going, these 2 worldviews that kind of saturate the day and age, both are wrong. All your explanations, all your expectations, all your answers, your precision, let's throw it all out and start over. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. And then I love what he says next. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. What a great answer. So we said last week, and you may remember, that the world we live in, our existence, the sin, the fallenness, the depravity, the suffering that we see in this world is a result of sin in the bloodstream. You remember this? We said that through Adam's choice, Adam's sin, the principle of death, the associated destruction that comes with it, just enters our existence, and we've had to deal with the fallout ever since. Jesus goes, this isn't a result of the baby didn't sin, like that's crazy. And the parents, like God would punish the parents by punishing the child. Like, I mean, come on. This is just the result of a fallen world. Like things that go wrong sometimes are just the result of living in a broken, fallen world. So neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened, and this is my favorite part of the verse, so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Isn't that cool? Jesus goes, his whole life, his whole blindness, this whole catastrophe, all of his suffering has been a buildup to this very moment. You ever feel like that might be true of you? Sometimes the things you endure, the situations you find yourself in, your back being against that wall. What if God is leading you to the end of yourself so that he can introduce a miracle? We've seen this before. You remember when he made the buffet from the lunchbox, like right before he did that miracle, Jesus said to Philip, oh man, there's thousands of people here. Where in the world are you going to get enough food to feed them all? If Philip goes, wait, what? Like we need to dismiss them so they can go find their own food. And Jesus goes, no. You feed them. And then John chapter 6, verse 6, John parenthetically whispers, he said this because he already had in mind what he was going to do. I love that promise. Like you knew he's setting Philip up. He got a little chuckle, I think, out of it. He's like, where are you going to feed all these people, Philip? Like, there's a lot of people, and all you got is a lunchbox. And Philip's like, what? He already had in mind. What if the same is true of you? What if everything you're experiencing is a setup for a miracle like this blind man? Jesus goes, he was born this way. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Like this miracle that's about to take place is going to cause people to see God's glory. This does not mean God deliberately caused this child to be born blind in order that after many years his glory should be displayed in the removal of the blindness. To think that it seems cruel to cause the child to be born blind in order that he could work a miracle. I mean, if he wants to do that, he can. It's God. It's his world. He can do whatever he wants. But I think what might be more the case is this child was born into a broken world. And so he just inherited some of that brokenness as nature of being here. But for a moment, God would use this thing and provide a healing that would bring him glory. Like he would usurp this blindness that he had in order to do something even better with it. Verse 4, Jesus says, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So he seems to understand here. It's a strange statement to make right after saying this about, I'm about to work a miracle. As long as this day, we must do the work. He understands the opportunity, though, for service of doing good in the world isn't going to last forever. And Jesus seems to also know, and this is important, because we're about to find out that this healing occurs on the Sabbath day. And that's a big deal. You're not allowed to heal on the Sabbath, which is a strange rule anyway. Because it's like if you have the power to heal, seems like you should be able to do it whenever. And they're like, nope. No healing on the Sabbath, right? That's one of their rules. He knew that healing this man on the Sabbath would bring greater opposition from the religious leaders who already wanted to silence and kill him. Remember, just a chapter before, they're looking for a way to trick him so that they can accuse him. We're going to find out in a moment this healing occurs on the Sabbath, which breaks the rules. Right? You're not allowed to heal on the Sabbath. These rules that the religious elite had come up with were very specific, very ordered, very precise. These people, these guys with all their information and supposed knowledge about God, they had these expectations and rules and little rules to help keep the big rules. The big rules for them are the 10 found in the law that Moses brought down from Sinai, the 10 commandments. And these Pharisees kind of developed this whole system of thinking around these rules. Remember, Israel is living under occupation by Rome. That's disgusting and offensive because the Romans are immoral. So to be ruled over by people that you consider so wicked is offensive. They knew that God prophesied in his Old Testament that one day he would send a rescuer, a Messiah. And it seems like he should want to right now. Why isn't he doing it? Maybe it's because we're not obeying the rules. And so these Pharisees would go around studying the rules. How do you keep the Maybe if we could, through obedience, become pleasing to God, he will finally say enough is enough and send his rescuer. So the Pharisees would study the rules. Keep the Sabbath holy. Well, that's great. What does that mean? Don't work on the Sabbath. Okay. What's work? Well, take off from, okay, all right, I'm not gonna clock in on Sundays. What about food? I gotta eat. Well, you can eat on the Sabbath. Okay, what if I have to make it? Ooh, I don't know. What about, okay, so if you make something, you can make something, okay, so if you make water from ice, that's not work because you're just letting it drip. But if you make a sandwich from bread and ham, that's two things. But okay, so new rule. Work is making something from two other things. We're not going to do that on the Sabbath. Okay, got it. They came up with all these rules, like 600 of them. Little rules that would help you keep the big rule. And then, not only would they live themselves beneath these rules, but they would try to make sure everyone else is doing it too. Because it makes no difference if I'm being moral, if you're not. If God is waiting for everyone's morality in order to send his rescuer, then not only do I have to legislate my own morality, I got to watch yours too. Which is what leads to this system of thought, this self-righteousness by which they lifeguard other people. These Pharisees and their endless little rules to help them keep the big ones, they started out as a desire to be pleasing to God, but somewhere along the way, they lost the plot. They missed the forest for the trees. They've got God right in front of them, and yet they can't even see it. That's how backwards it becomes. And Jesus is in this position where he has an opportunity to perform healing upon someone, but it's the Sabbath. And he goes, you know what? My compassion for this man is it's going to drive me to heal him anyway and to teach these pious guys a lesson because they missed something along the way. And I want to remind them the rules aren't God. God is God. Verse 6. Such a mic drop, right? Verse 6. After saying this, he spit on the ground. That's interesting. He spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva. I mean, imagine your first time, if you've never read this before, you're like, wait, hold on. What did he do? It's like he gives this great like mic drop moment. Like, I got to do this right now. I'm going to teach these fellas a lesson. You're like, what, did he just? He made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Imagine you're a disciple. You're like, oh, hold on. Like, oh, wait. This is so, I mean, why? You've seen him do other miracles, like the lunchbox thing. Is like, he just did it. Like, you don't need to spit. Like, why are you hawking? Yeah, there's other times he just pronounces a healing. He just says, your servant is healed. Go back home. When you get there, he'll be all better, right? There's other times where he accidentally heals. A lady grabs his cloak and he's like, did someone touch me? You know, like, why this? Why heal in this way? Do you remember those rules? There was a rule about making something from two other things. Making something like mud, perhaps, from and dirt. It's the last time I do it, I'll promise. He's trampling the rules. He's specifically healing him in a way that breaks all of their preconceived notions about God. You can't make a new thing from two other things. That's one of those 600 rules. Jesus goes, watch me. And then he puts the mud on the man's eyes. That's against the rules also. Jesus goes, watch me. And then he commands him to go wash. Well, washing on the Sabbath is against one of those 600 rules. Jesus goes, watch me. And then the distance from where he was and the pool is a distance that was not allowed to be traveled by foot on the Sabbath. And Jesus goes, watch me. I'm going to send him to go wash. He's not just breaking their rules. He's trampling their rules. Verse 8, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, is this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claim that he was. I love that they don't ask him. Right? They're not, I mean, they're just going to talk about it in front of him, but not ask him directly. I think too, isn't it true that sometimes in just the world that we live in, when somebody has something that we consider like that's broken, like we consider they have other things wrong too, like it just seems so so disrespectful. All throughout this story, they act as if this man doesn't exist. Right? When they stumble up on him, the disciples start talking about him right in front of him as if he can't hear, as if he's not a person, as if he doesn't have a soul and a heart, that he doesn't have feelings. They walk up and they go, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents?" Like he's not even there. And then when he's healed, the people go, "Is this the guy? Is this the guy?" Like he's not even there. They don't treat him like a person. They treat him like a riddle, like a thing. You remember just a chapter before, we said this of the woman caught in adultery. Those men didn't see her as a person with a soul made in the image of God. They saw her as a riddle that they could trap Jesus with. She was a means to an end. She was a weapon. Jesus seems to routinely be so against that way of thinking. This man to be talked about in this way. I had a friend of my youth pastors growing up who was another youth pastor. His name was Jerry, and he was in a wheelchair. He was paralyzed from the neck down. And I remember we would often go on trips together, and it wouldn't be unusual to be going through the checkout line in a grocery store. And as someone was counting back his cash to him, they would say it so loud, $2, $3, $4. And I would go, "Jerry, what's that about?" And he goes, "It's so funny. Because I'm paralyzed, people also assume I'm deaf." Like the broad strokes that we paint people when we categorize them, I see that happening to this man. They don't bother asking him, "Are you the man?" They go, "Is this Master, who sinned?" Like as if he's not even there. Finally, they get around to asking him. Verse 9, he himself insisted, "I'm that man." "How then," verse 10, "were your eyes opened?" He replied, "The man they called Jesus," I love that, circle, underline, highlight. "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes." He left the spit out. "He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." Notice how little he knows about Jesus at this point. He doesn't seem to know he's from Nazareth or that he's a Messiah or claim to be God or even the light of the world, which he'll call himself at the end of the story. He didn't even know where Jesus was from. He seemed to only know that Jesus was his name, and that's who he heard healed him, because remember, he hasn't seen him yet. He was blind still with mud in his eyes when he got sent away to wash. Verse 12, "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. So now they're going to the religious leaders. Maybe they can weigh in. Maybe they know what happened. Now the day on which Jesus made the mud and opened the man's eyes, the soundtrack now changes, was the Sabbath. There it is. That's the game changer. When Jesus took the initiative to perform this miracle, he could have done it on any day he chose. He could have come back the next day. He could have done it the day before, right? He's God. He's kind of in charge of the calendar. He knows what he can do, and yet he chooses to heal him on the Sabbath to challenge the petty traditions of these religious leaders. Traditions that they lifted to the place of being law, lifted to the place of being God. Jesus goes, "We got to trample this and start over." Verse 15, "Therefore the Pharisees also asked, 'How did he receive his sight?' 'Well, he put mud on my eyes,' the man replied, 'and I washed, and now I see.'" You can see him getting a little bit frustrated, repeating himself so often. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, "This man's not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." So to the Pharisees, the man couldn't be from God. Jesus couldn't be from God because he didn't line up with their expectations, with their prejudices, their traditions. In fact, in the Greek there, this man, the way it's phrased, it's contemptuous. They're going, this guy ain't from God. Verse 16, "But others asked, 'Well, then how can a sinner perform such signs?' So they were divided. And the basis of the divide is, okay, either Jesus is a sinner and should be rejected, or our understanding and application of Sabbath law is wrong. That's what they have to choose between. And notice through the rest of this conversation how stubborn they are. It's easier to see Jesus as not being who he obviously says he is than for them to accept their view might be wrong, Verse 17, they then turned again to the blind man. This is fun because you're going to watch it start to get hotter and hotter as this man starts to get more and more annoyed. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. Still, they didn't believe him that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. So it's easier for them to believe that the man was never really blind than it is to believe that Jesus healed him. Right? In their blindness, it's easier to believe. And then they want to bring his parents in on it because they're like, well, okay, maybe they can testify. Maybe this guy is a whole charade. Maybe he's been pretending the last 30 years, all for this moment. It's a big setup. Verse 19, is this your son, they asked? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see? Well, we know he is our son. The parents, you love these parents. We know he's our son, and we know he was born blind. How he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. The religious leaders, they asked the parents to verify that the man was truly born blind. The tone of their question implies that they wondered if the parents were even in on some conspiracy. Right? And the parents verify, he's our son. We can tell you he was born blind. We don't really know what happened after that. We do know he can see now, right? They wouldn't speak to how he or who performed the healing because they were afraid, John tells us, verse 22. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be kicked out of the synagogue. That's why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. It's the threat of excommunication that causes them to throw their own son under the bus. Oh, it is instinctive and normal for parents to protect our children, even if our children are adults. But they are so frightened by this threat of excommunication, so frightened by the religious elite that all they could do is put the attention back on their son, and they back away from that spotlight. Verse 24, a second time, they summoned the man who'd been born blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, which is so funny and ironic because that's exactly what he's trying to do. We know this man is a sinner. They say this not because Jesus broke the law of God, but because he broke their traditions, right? And despite the evidence, not because of it. Verse 25, whether or not he is a sinner, I don't know. I love this verse. One thing I do know, I was blind, now I see. This man doesn't know everything about Jesus, but he does know Jesus touched his life. And at this moment, this is an irrefutable argument. I mean, what can you say to that? They verify, like you can't argue that, okay, you were blind before and now you see. Verse 26, then they asked him, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I've told you already and you don't listen. Why? Do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples also? I love this guy. He's laying it on so thick. I don't know if he's being sarcastic on purpose. I think so. I think he's getting a little heated with all the repetition and the refusal to admit what's so plainly obvious that Jesus is who he said he is. Intending it or not, this healed man mocks their prejudiced rejection of Jesus. He mocks them, and notice too, he proclaims himself to be a disciple of Jesus at this point. He says, do you want to become his disciples too? So now he's a disciple. This is beautiful. It's a growing awareness of who he is. Verse 28, they then hurled insults at him. You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answers, and this is, I love, he's getting bolder and bolder or more and more impatient, however you look at it. Now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. He listens to godly people who do his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, and look at, this is how far they dig down to come up with this insult. You were steeped in sin at birth. Remind him of his past. Remember the beginning of the story? That belief, like you sinned in the womb. Let me remind you how bad you are, how wicked you are, where you come from. Oh, we all have accusers. You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. These religious leaders in this day and age, they despised common people, but especially this man. He has a growing confidence in what's happened to him, still not entire, but growing. They were especially angry because they knew he was right and they were wrong. And they treat him terribly for it. They abuse him, they revile him, they insult him. You're steeped in sin at birth. They reject him, they cast him out. And now enter Jesus. He kind of ducked out on the date. He healed the man and then disappeared. He waits till he's rejected and then meets back up with him. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, this is so beautiful. Do you believe in the Son of Man? The religious leaders rejected the man who Jesus healed. Jesus makes it a point to go and find him and then looks deep into his eyes. They've never seen each other until this point. He's healed him. He's caused him a lot of pain in the process, a lot of rejection, a lot of hurt, a lot of humiliation, being kicked out, excommunicated, possibly losing his parents, and then they meet back up and look eyeball to eyeball. Do you believe in me? Verse 36, who is the Son of Man, sir? Tell me that I might believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and worshiped him. What a beautiful story. Notice that the man shows an increasing awareness of who Jesus is throughout the story. One that doesn't finally or fully culminate until this scene, ironically outside the temple. The temple is the place for the worship of God, but he's kicked out because of his unintended intersection with Jesus. And he gradually goes all inside one chapter from believing Jesus is a prophet to believing himself to be a disciple of Jesus, to stating this man must be from God, to believing he must be the Son of God, to calling Jesus someone in whom he trusts, to finally worshiping him. A growing awareness and worshiping him at that outside the temple, the place of worship. Jesus finds him there in his rejection. He extends an invitation to him to believe in him. Says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And when he asks that, it's revealed to him that the Son of Man is exactly who Jesus is. And rather than argue, he worships him. The religious leader said, you can't worship with us at the temple. Jesus goes, I'll receive your worship outside it. Imagine how this man's sight must have come to him too. Right? He's never used eyes before. He's never seen before. Right? It's not lost on me that it's minutes that he's had sight before he's asked to provide a description of the man who healed him. He didn't know what a face was minutes ago. He'd never seen one before. His eyes are blurry. The image is slow and blinking and fuzzy, a distorted vision that's never been activated, never been used. I find it so funny that within minutes of receiving his sight, he's asked to give a description rather than celebrating his sight. Never seen a face, let alone a person. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to try to describe someone? In Mark chapter 8, Jesus heals another man who's blind. We're not told how long that man was blind, whether he was born with it or not, but we think not. Why? Because when Jesus heals him, he says, tell me what you see. And the man says, I see people walking around like trees. You're like, that's a crude description. Well, he hasn't used his eyes in a while. But the fact he knows what trees are implies maybe he's had sight before. This man has never had it. Never had it. And he's given it. The lights are turned on. And he's interrogated and asked for a description. He's of no use, though, to the sketch artist. He's never seen a face. Despite his visual awareness, just like his spiritual awareness, his vision grows, his spiritual vision grows. He takes his first sighted steps, like a baby learning to walk, but these steps are attacked and questions, and still he takes them. As things come more and more into focus, it's only then that he's met with a look into the eyes of his healer. Isn't that so representative of our lives down here? I mean, don't we, as we fumble along, as we move, we're sick with it, we're blind, and maybe Jesus intercepts us. Maybe we come into contact with him and he gives us our vision back. He gives us but we still haven't seen our healer. We're left here to meander our way back through life, to grope our way along, to feel our way along. And people ask us questions. They interrogate us too. People with different worldviews about our spirituality. And we're forced to rely on words like feel or trust or have faith. We're tempted at times to think that we're foolish, that we're wrong and they're right. We think maybe we're the crazy ones when the gospel says you're exactly right. There's a Jesus who's going to look long into your eyes when you get there. And not a moment before. Our faith, our walk, our stumble through this life is rewarded. We stumble, but we trust, and one day we will see him. And until then, our only response, just as this man, is to worship him. Our only response to the questions of our interrogators is a changed life. You notice that. They have all these questions that the man's like, I don't have answers. I don't know what happened. I don't know about molecules or sight. Like, I've literally just seen things for the first time. I don't know what he looked like. I didn't know what a face was 2 minutes ago. I didn't know what a nose looked like, let alone a Jesus, a healer. I think many of us don't share our faith because we're intimidated. We don't share about Jesus or share about our spirituality, our relationship with him. We avoid conversations of worldview or religion because we don't feel prepared for the follow-up questions. We're intimidated. What if they ask us something? What if they interrogate? What if they scrutinize the way they do in this story? What if someone asks something hard? What if there's a question about Genesis or world origins? I'm not a scientist. What is it, science or faith? I don't know what they might ask. I might not have an answer. I'm going to embarrass. I better just keep away from it entirely. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And this man goes, I don't have a scientific explanation for you. If that's what you're looking for, I ain't got it. But here's what I can tell you. Once I was blind, now I can see. Guys, it's hard to argue with the personal testimony, isn't it? I think that's one of the most reliable things about the New Testament, the changed lives we see in here. 11 of these guys, not 12, 11 of these guys changed drastically after the resurrection. Right? Remember Peter? These guys were cowards when Jesus was executed. They went into hiding. They thought they might be next. But Peter was intimidating out of acknowledging Jesus by a middle school aged girl around a campfire where he's like, hey, me, no. He goes into hiding. And then suddenly they go from that to being these warriors for Jesus. James, the author of the New Testament epistle of James, is the earthly brother of Jesus, who openly says, I didn't believe him either during his earthly ministry. I mean, and that's pretty compelling. You're like, what would your brother have to do to convince you they were God, right? James is like, sorry, I'm not buying it. But then he sees Jesus killed, sees him come back to life, and goes from being a denier to being the pastor of the Jerusalem church, leader of the movement. That's hard to argue with. He says he was given a post-resurrection appearance by the Lord Jesus, his brother who he saw dead. This changed life. There's no argument against the changed life. I think if there were more changed lives, maybe there'd be more evangelism on our part. Maybe if we focused less on answers and more on testimony, there'd be more evangelism, which begs the question, has your life changed as a result of meeting Jesus? Can you say what this man says? Like, I don't know about, was it 7 literal days or ages? Like, I don't know, but here's what I can tell you. Here's who I was before. Here's who I am now. You tell me. Kind of like this man here. Has your life changed in that way? When you've been arrested, intercepted, healed by an amazing grace, isn't it an awful lot like going from blindness to sightedness? On New Year's Day in 1773, John Newton was asked to write a hymn that could illustrate a sermon preached in Buckinghamshire, which is probably the most British name I've ever heard. Buckinghamshire. As he wrote, he began to think of his own story. He was a degenerate. His life was marked by headstrong disobedience. He debuted into sailing. He tailspun further and further and further down as his behavior became more and more foul, his mouth more offensive. This routinely landed him with fewer and fewer options. One doesn't enter the despicable trade of slave trading because one chooses to. One does this wicked practice as you fall into having no other option. He bottomed out into it. As he thought back, he remembered his turning point. Aboard a ship named the Greyhound, one night the sailor found his life in danger as a storm pummeled and pummeled and pummeled the ship. A person standing in the place where he had just been was thrown, hurled overboard by the angry sea. And he thought back to his religious upbringing, his faithful mother who died when he was young, the tragic choices that he made that led to such a degenerate life, choices that landed him on this ship in the first place. And that night, he surrendered his life to Jesus. He would eventually leave slave trading, leave his life of sailing altogether. He'd follow Jesus. He'd study the Bible. He'd work on behalf of freeing slaves to put an end to it. He'd write against, extensively, the evil institution. He'd eventually find himself a pastor, one whose sermons and hymns and writings would become unprecedentedly popular, likely because the manner of life he walked in prior to it. People listened because that was a changed life. That wit, that tongue, that talent that could write such crude but catchy songs that land him in so much trouble, he'd now use this to write songs about God. Songs about Jesus, songs about his healer, songs about someone who intersected him and turned him from that lost, obscene, crude, degenerate slave trader to an Anglican clergyman and poet. On New Year's Day, 1773, charged with writing a hymn that would illustrate the amazing grace that so captivated his own heart and changed the direction of his life, with his pen in his hand, he'd write words from personal experience. Words of forgiveness and redemption made possible regardless of sins committed. Oh, as he sat on that boat, he wondered if God would even bother saving someone like him. He wrote about words of his soul's deliverance from despair through the mercy of God. Words that would go on to become one of the most recognizable songs in the English-speaking world. Words that would become the most famous folk hymn in all time. Words estimated by one American historian to be sung 10 million times annually. How they know that, I don't know. Words lifted from this story. I once was blind, but now I see. It's hard to argue with that. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Boy, was he a wretch. Many people don't know that. He didn't enter slave trading. He landed there because of his foul mouth. He was degenerate, a wretch like me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, the prodigal son. Was blind, but now I see. This man. As you reflect, is that your story? Have you been rescued? Have you been resurrected? Have you been arrested by that grace? A wretch like you. Even a wretch like you. On the night before he died, Jesus shared a final meal with his disciples. And during the meal, he wanted to give them for all time a special way of remembering that amazing grace. That amazing grace that sent him. That amazing grace that is our healer, our vision. He gave us a special way of remembering him, reflecting, just like John Newton did on that night when it all changed. Jesus says, fellas, the night before his crucifixion, he says, fellas, tomorrow everything's going to change. They're going to kill me. That's where this is headed. But don't worry, because on Sunday I'll pull off Easter. And they didn't know what that meant. He says, it's okay. We're going to get scattered. This is the last chance we have to be like this together. And I want you to remember it. I want you to keep coming back here. Because there's still a lot of time left between here and there. Between us and our home. And you're going to need a built-in way of remembering. A built-in way of reflecting. A built-in way of coming back and realizing who you are and whose you are and where this is all headed. You're going to need a chance to reflect on the amazing grace that I'm going to save you with. And that'll be strength for your journey. So this morning as we close, we're going to move towards the tables. Tables with bread and with juice that represent exactly what Jesus said it would represent. His body that would be broken for us. His blood that would be shed for us. The amazing grace that would arrest us. So I'm going to pray. We're going to invite the Holy Spirit into this space. As we always do, we ask that he search our hearts. As we prepare ourselves to come to this table, there's something powerful about this table. And then after a moment, we'd ask that you move to it, if you feel ready. To receive there the bread, the juice, we'd ask that you hold these elements as you head back to your seats. And once you arrive there, we'll all partake together. And we'll go out of here singing about that amazing grace. So Lord Jesus, we come to this table just like you told us to. We remember just like you told us to. We reflect just like you told us to. About the grace you offer us on account of your death and resurrection. You're our healer. And we look forward to the day that we will cross this life into the next and look you in the eye and worship you just as this man did. Would you give us strength till then? There's a lot of time yet between here and our home. And Jesus, search us. We want this moment to be personal between us and you. So Spirit, fall in this room. Amen.
Thank you again for joining us online. We hope you enjoyed the message. To connect with us, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. For more information on who we are, check out our website, midtownvineyardchurch.com. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you leave us a review or drop us a comment. Until next time, have a great day.